Instead of being called wise men during the Christmas pageant at the church where I grew up, they were often referred to as wise guys. You see, these great biblical characters, the Magi, who are often regally portrayed in art and in literature, were often played by the older teenagers in our parish. And it kind of became a joke for them to make their appearance during the Christmas pageant as these Magi characters with a goofy grin on their face and just kind of looking like, well, wise guys. And in fact, in the back of the church where all the different children and youth would gather before the Christmas pageant, there was a sign for these Magi that read, "Wise guys, wait here and knock it off." Now, Tim and Corinne and Lily, I don't know where those guys went, and I'm not calling them wise guys. In fact, they did a really nice job being very regal and portraying those kings and wise guys in a very good way, so nice job wherever you are. But, sometimes they might be wise guys. But I can't help but smile every time I think about these Magi who we hear about in this morning's gospel lesson. There has been a lot of creative imagination that has gone into how we remember these wandering Magi who come to visit the baby Jesus. Countless artists have depicted them in their paintings and drawings. Poets such as T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats have used their words to recreate the story of the Magi. There are a number of hymns about these guys, and even musicians like James Taylor have written songs about them. I was joking with Larry and Carl the other day that even in the Middle Ages they were given names: Malquire, Gasper, and Balthazar. I particularly like that last one, Balthazar. I think I might start calling some people that one here and there. But I typically picture these wise guys, these Magi, as these three royal figures riding on camels in the outline of the desert sky. Kind of, how they're portrayed in Christmas cards and things like that. But for all the creative imagination that has gone into how we remember these guys, we really don't know a whole lot about them, except for perhaps that they came from a foreign land in the east, that they were good at looking at the stars and looking for signs, and that they offered gifts to Jesus. The author of the Gospel of Matthew never refers to them as kings, and despite the popular perception that there were three of them, we really don't know how many there were. The Syriac church in the Middle East claims that there was 12 Magi. So there you go. How many were there? We really don't know. Some scholars suggest that because of their familiarity with the star, these Magi were part of the priestly caste of the Zoroastrian religion, which had a well-known reputation for astrology and for studying the stars. Now, whether all these details happened in a certain way or not, and despite the religious imagination and our creative imagination that has gone into how we remember these guys, there's still an important and deep truth that this story communicates about how God works. To start, the author of Matthew creates this pretty noticeable contrast between the reaction of the Magi and of Herod to the news of Jesus' birth. The Magi, on one hand, sincerely wish to pay homage to Jesus, the King of the Jews. They are watchful and expectant, looking for signs of God's inbreaking. They are willing to travel to where Jesus is to be found, seeking no honor for themselves, arriving only to worship Jesus and to be in his presence. They are gladly willing to humble themselves, kneeling before a woman and her child, and they are willing to participate in God's generosity. In response to God's generosity, they offer their own gifts that they have to Jesus. So in a number of ways, these magi display characteristics, some of the core characteristics of discipleship. Now, on the other hand, Herod, who claims to be the king of the Jews, is insincere about his desire to worship Jesus and to pay homage to Jesus. And just as a little refresher, Herod was the puppet king of Judea at the time, and he really wasn't all that great of the guy. He was notorious for reacting savagely to people and to potential threats to his kingship. And we hear in the verses after this morning's story, the gospel goes on to explain how Herod sought to kill Jesus by having all the children who are 2 years and younger in Bethlehem slaughtered. Not a very nice guy. Not a good thing to do, Herod. And despite all this talk of servant leadership that the prophets of Israel had commanded, Herod was this tyrant king who was only concerned with his own self-interests. So this contrast that the author of Matthew sets up goes to show that birthright, that kingship, that social status, that being on the inside has nothing to do with whom God favors. And ironically, it's these foreign magi from the east who inform Herod and the chief priests and the scribes that the Messiah has arrived. So perhaps this is why we hear in this morning's story that Herod and all of Jerusalem were afraid. Not only does the birth of this new baby, deemed to be the king of the Jews, pose a threat to Herod's power, but also the presence of these magi and their pursuit of God's Messiah reveals that the world is changing. The arrival of these foreign astrologers is a sign that God's embrace extends much wider than we had normally thought possible. There is no longer insider and outsider, because God intends to draw all people to God's self. Even these Zoroastrian priest astrologers. And for some, this can be really scary, especially for those who thrive on creating division in order to maintain power. It can be scary to know that God's embrace extends much further than what we are normally comfortable with. But all of the lessons that we heard this morning, in one way or another, center around this theme that God's presence is made known and is present in people and in places that are often considered to be outside the normal religious community. The prophet Isaiah, the first reading that we heard this morning, explains that Israel is to be a light to the nations, that they shouldn't be too internally focused because the rebuilding of their community is going to involve people and nations outside themselves. The author of Ephesians, the other reading that we heard this morning, proclaims and says that the ultimate purpose of God is for the unification of humanity in this multicultural society. No insiders and no outsiders. And then finally, the gospel lesson we hear, the one that I've been preaching on for these last few minutes or so, does away and breaks down any sort of notion of insiders and outsiders. Christ is revealed to those who are thought to be on the outside, the Magi, and is rejected by those who are thought to be on the inside, Herod and the chief priests and the scribes. So these lessons go on to encourage us to look for and be aware of God's presence and God's glory and those places that we might least expect. So perhaps we have a thing or two to learn from the story of these magi, these wise guys. First, God's embrace extends much further, much wider than we can even begin to imagine, crumbling the barriers that separate us. And second, these magi offer us a glimpse into what discipleship is all about. We too are called to be watchful and expectant, looking for signs of God's inbreaking. We too are called to travel to where Jesus can be found. And in our day and age, that means being in relation with those people whose company Jesus seeks and keeps, the poor, the excluded, those who are on the outside. And we too are called to participate in the complete outpouring of love that is the very nature of God, offering our time and our talents and our resources to God and to one another. I like the way that one scholar puts it. Discipleship is about learning how to be a place in the world where the act of God can come alive. So, my friends, how are we using our time, our talent, our resources to be a place where the act of God can come alive? Amen.